Some people think privilege gives them the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. But what happens when that arrogance meets reality? When a woman used to getting her way humiliates a child in public, only to be left speechless by the truth? You won't believe what unfolds at this elite country club when a wealthy woman tries to put a young black boy in his place. She assumes she holds all the power until his mother arrives. And let me tell you, when she realizes who she just disrespected, the look on her face is priceless. Stay with me, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The heat hung heavy in the air, the kind that made the pavement sizzle under bare feet. The sun, a relentless ball of fire in the cloudless sky, cast sharp reflections on the shimmering blue surface of the pool at Brookdale Country Club, an exclusive retreat nestled in the heart of Fairview, a town where wealth whispered in the architecture, in the neatly manicured lawns, in the effortless luxury of every detail. Under the shade of towering palm trees, elegant women in oversized sunglasses and designer swimsuits lounged on padded chairs, sipping cold drinks served on silver trays. Laughter echoed from a group of men in crisp linen shirts gathered near the outdoor bar, ice clinking in their highball glasses as they talked business between sips of expensive whiskey. Children's squeals of delight rang through the air as they splashed in the water, their tiny arms paddling frantically in an attempt to race one another. The smell of chlorine mixed with the subtle scent of coconut. Sunscreen, a sensory signature of long, lazy summer afternoons. Amidst this postcard-perfect scene, Ethan Carter, a 10-year-old black boy, moved cautiously along the pool's edge. His swim trunks, a vibrant shade of blue, clung to his small frame, and the neon orange floaties strapped to his arms contrasted against his deep brown skin. His curls, still damp from his last dive, glistened under the sun. His mother had told him she'd be here soon, and though he trusted her, he still felt out of place. His fingers traced the warm tiles at the pool's border as he watched the other kids. Some of them looked like they had been coming here forever, moving with the kind of ease he hadn't yet mastered. But he wasn't intimidated, just excited. A little girl with blonde pigtails shot down the water slide, landing with a dramatic splash beside him. Ethan grinned, watching her laugh as she wiped the water from her face. "That was awesome," he said, his enthusiasm genuine. She looked at him for a moment, then smiled back. "You should try it," she encouraged. Ethan nodded eagerly and turned toward the slide, his heart beating fast with anticipation. But before he could take a step, a sharp, clipped voice cut through the warm afternoon air. "Excuse me." The sound was like ice cracking in the heat, halting the moment before it could bloom. Ethan turned toward the voice, his excitement faltering. A woman stood at the edge of the pool, her manicured fingers adjusting the brim of her expensive sun hat. Victoria Sinclair, a picture of wealth and status, radiated an effortless elegance in her white cover-up, her golden hair cascading in carefully styled waves. But despite the beauty, her eyes carried something cold, something that made Ethan's stomach tighten. She wasn't looking at him with curiosity. She was looking at him like he was a misplaced object. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged with something sharp. Ethan blinked. "No, ma'am," he replied, politely. Victoria's lips pressed together as if his response didn't satisfy her. "Whose child are you?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over him. Ethan hesitated. He had been taught to be polite, to respect adults, but something about the way she was looking at him made his chest feel heavy. "My mom said I could swim here," he answered, his voice steady but cautious. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to betray her thoughts. "Did she?" she mused, as though the idea was unlikely. For the first time, Ethan felt truly aware of the way the space around him had shifted. The casual murmurs of conversation had quieted just enough for people to listen without appearing obvious. A lifeguard, a teenage boy in a red polo, glanced their way but didn't intervene. A couple nearby exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Ethan swallowed. "Yes, ma'am," he said again. Victoria exhaled, as if debating whether this was worth her time. Then, with a tight smile, she leaned down slightly, lowering her voice in what she likely thought was a kind gesture. "Sweetheart, I don't know what your situation is, but this is a private club. There are rules, membership requirements. You understand, don't you?" The words didn't need to be spelled out. Ethan wasn't stupid. His fingers curled against the damp tile. "My mum is a member," he said, his voice quieter now, but firm. Victoria's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind her eyes, annoyance, disbelief, maybe even amusement. "Oh, and who exactly is your mother?" she asked, her tone laced with mock curiosity. Ethan hesitated. He had a feeling that no matter what he said, it wouldn't be enough. "She's coming soon," he said simply. Victoria straightened, her arms crossing. "Of course she is," she said, her smile polite but patronizing. Ethan suddenly wished he was anywhere else. The slide, which had moments ago seemed like an exciting adventure, now felt distant, irrelevant. He could still hear the children playing, but it was as if he was no longer part of the same world. Victoria was still watching him, but her attention had begun to drift. She had made her point, satisfied that she had done whatever it was she thought was necessary. Ethan turned away, his throat tight. He had never felt small before, but in that moment, under the weight of her gaze and the whispers around him, he had never felt smaller. The air was thick with heat, but Ethan barely noticed it anymore. The excitement he had felt just minutes ago had drained from his body, leaving behind a quiet unease. The water, once a place of joy, now felt colder against his skin. He could still feel the weight of Victoria Sinclair's gaze, sharp as a blade, slicing into him with silent judgment. She hadn't said anything outright cruel. She hadn't needed to. Ethan took a deep breath and turned his focus back to the pool, trying to shake off the feeling. He wasn't about to let some lady ruin his day. He had been waiting all week to come here. His mother had promised, and she never made promises she couldn't keep. Summoning his courage, he pushed off from the pool's edge, letting himself float for a moment before paddling toward the deeper end. The sun was warm on his face, the water smooth and cool. He was a strong swimmer. His mum had made sure of that. But just as he reached the spot where the depth changed, he heard it. "Excuse me!" The voice was sharp, cutting through the summer air like a crack of thunder. Ethan turned, his heart thudding as he saw Victoria standing at the poolside again, this time with a hand resting firmly on her hip. Her sunglasses now sat on top of her head, revealing icy blue eyes that locked onto him with something between irritation and condescension. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her tone light but unmistakably firm. Ethan hesitated, confused. I was just swimming," he said, his voice uncertain. Victoria pursed her lips, glancing around the pool as if expecting someone to step in and remove him. "Sweetheart, this section is for experienced swimmers," she said, tilting her head. "Are you sure you belong here?" The words hit Ethan like a slap. A lump formed in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "I know how to swim," he said, keeping his voice steady. Victoria let out a small, airy laugh. "I'm sure you think you do, but this club has standards and safety policies. Maybe you should stick to the shallow end where it's safer." Ethan's fingers clenched around the pool's ledge. He could feel the eyes of others on him now, curious glances, quiet murmurs. He had heard whispers like this before, not always directed at him, but at people who looked like him. His mom had told him about this kind of thing, about the way some people believed without saying it outright that certain places weren't meant for people like them. Still, he had never thought he'd feel it here. "I'm not in danger," Ethan said, his voice smaller now. Victoria sighed, shaking her head as if he were a child refusing to listen to reason. "Listen, sweetheart," she said, her tone softer now, as if she were so patient, so understanding. "I know this must be exciting for you, getting to be here, but this club is very particular about its members and guests. Maybe your parents didn't explain all the rules to you, so why don't we find them and clear this up?" Ethan's stomach twisted. "My mom is coming soon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria arched an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Is she now?" she said, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "And what's her name?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to tell her, not because he was afraid his mom could handle anyone, but because he already knew how this game worked. No matter what he said, she wouldn't believe him. He had seen it before, on TV, in books, even in real life. People like Victoria didn't need facts. They didn't need proof. They had already made up their minds the moment they looked at him. Victoria must have mistaken his silence for uncertainty because she let out a small, triumphant hum. "That's what I thought," she murmured. And then, in a voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear, she added, "Well, until we find out who's responsible for you, I think it's best if you get out of the deep end." Ethan's face burned. He could feel the stares of other guests, some watching with quiet interest, others pretending not to notice at all. For a moment, he considered arguing. He could tell her she was wrong. He could tell her that his mum was a member and had every right to bring him here. He could tell her that he had more than enough swimming experience and that her rules didn't scare him. But he didn't, because in that moment, he realized something. It wouldn't matter, not to her. Victoria had already decided who he was, and nothing he said would change that. So, with a tight jaw and stinging eyes, Ethan took a slow breath, turned away, and paddled back toward the shallow end. Not because he couldn't swim, not because he didn't belong, but because, at that moment, he didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing him fight. The water felt heavier now. It clung to Ethan's skin, dragging at his limbs as he made his way back to the shallow end. The excitement he'd felt earlier, the thrill of being here, had been replaced by something else, something cold and heavy sitting in his chest. He could still feel her eyes on him. Even without turning around, he knew Victoria Sinclair was watching, her presence looming over him like a shadow stretching across the pool deck. But it wasn't just her anymore. As he waded through the water, he caught glimpses of people, adults lounging under umbrellas, couples sipping cocktails, lifeguards shifting on their stools. They weren't staring outright. No, that would be too obvious. Instead, their glances were quick, stolen, exchanged in silent understanding before they turned away, pretending they hadn't been watching at all. And then there were the whispers. Low murmurs drifted through the air, barely audible beneath the splashing of water and the hum of summer. Conversations. Who is he with? Did he sneak in? You'd think they'd have better security at a place like this. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his hands clenched into fists beneath the water. His mom had always told him that people would judge before they knew anything about him, that some would see his skin before they saw him. But knowing something in theory and feeling it in real time were two different things. He reached the shallower end, gripping the pool's edge with fingers that trembled despite the warmth in the air. A boy about his age, sandy-haired and wearing bright red swim trunks, floated nearby on an inflatable ring. He had been watching the whole thing, his brow furrowed. "What did she say to you?" the boy asked, paddling closer. Ethan hesitated, still feeling the burn of humiliation in his chest. "She said I shouldn't be in the deep end," he muttered, barely glancing up. The boy frowned. "But you were swimming fine," he said. Ethan exhaled sharply. Through his nose. "Yeah, I know that. You know that. She doesn't care." Instead of saying that out loud, he just shrugged. The boy looked toward Victoria, who had now settled back into her lounge chair, sipping her iced tea as if nothing had happened. "That lady is always complaining about something," the boy said with a roll of his eyes. "Last week she got mad at my little sister for eating too close to the pool, said she didn't want crumbs in the water." Ethan gave a half smile, but it faded quickly. This wasn't the same. This wasn't about crumbs in the water. It was about him. The boy seemed to sense it too, because he hesitated before saying, "My dad says she acts like she owns this place, but she doesn't. She just likes making people feel bad." Ethan nodded slowly, the lump in his throat still there. He wanted to believe it was just that, just a grumpy, entitled woman who liked enforcing rules that weren't even hers. But deep down, he knew better. She hadn't cared when other kids splashed in the deep end. She hadn't pulled anyone else aside, just him, and he wasn't the only one who had noticed. A group of women sat nearby, their sunglasses masking their expressions, but Ethan could tell they had seen everything. One of them, a woman with dark curls pulled into a bun, glanced toward him with something close to sympathy. But she said nothing. None of them did. They just sat there, sipping their drinks, watching. Ethan gritted his teeth, hating the way it made him feel, like he was on display, like he was something to be observed rather than a part of the world around him. His mom had always told him to carry himself with confidence, to walk into a room like he belonged there. But right now, standing in this pool, under these eyes, he wasn't so sure anymore. His fingers gripped the wet tiles harder. He wished she would get here soon. The heat pressed down like a thick blanket, but Ethan barely felt it. The sting in his chest was sharper than the sun's glare, heavier than the weight of the water against his skin. The quiet whispers still floated in the air, disappearing into the summer breeze like smoke, and yet they felt suffocating. His fingers were still curled around the pool's edge when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Not hurried, not hesitant, purposeful. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was deep, steady, carrying the kind of authority that made people stop mid-sentence. Ethan turned his head, and for the first time in minutes, he saw Victoria Sinclair's expression shift. Just slightly, just enough. The mild, almost amused condescension she had worn so effortlessly cracked at the edges as she straightened in her lounge chair. Standing a few feet away was James Holloway, a man well known in the club. Mid-50s, silver-streaked hair, sharp features softened only by the hint of smile, lines around his mouth. Dressed in a navy polo and pressed khakis, he looked every bit the image of an elite country club member, except for the way his eyes were locked onto Victoria with quiet scrutiny. Ethan didn't know much about him, but he knew this. James Holloway was the kind of man people listened to. Victoria lifted her sunglasses, resting them on her perfectly highlighted hair. "Oh, James," she said smoothly, her lips curving into a tight, practiced smile. "Nothing to worry about. I was just making sure this young man understood the club's rules." James's gaze flickered toward Ethan, then back to Victoria. "Which rule was in question?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Victoria let out a soft, airy laugh, tilting her head slightly. "It's not really about a specific rule," she said, waving a delicate hand. "You know how things are here. We have standards. I simply wanted to ensure everything was in order." Ethan could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. Standards. That was the word people used when they didn't want to say what they really meant. James let the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to settle over the pool deck. "You mean the same standards that allow every other child here to swim freely?" he asked, arching a brow. Victoria's smile didn't falter, but her fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. "I was only concerned for his safety," she said, her voice as smooth as glass. "His safety," James repeated, his tone unreadable. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, but James wasn't looking at him. He was still watching Victoria, waiting. Victoria hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "You know how liability works, James," she said. "We can't be too careful these days. I'm sure you understand." James nodded slowly, like he was considering her words. Then, with a slight shift in his stance, he spoke again. "I do understand," he said. "I understand that you watched a child swim just fine, then decided he needed to be monitored because he doesn't fit the image you expect." A ripple of silence followed his words. Victoria's lips parted slightly, caught between protest and composure. James turned to Ethan then, his voice dropping just enough to feel like a reassurance. "You're a strong swimmer?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." James gave a small, approving nod before turning back to Victoria. "Then I think we're done here," he said simply. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Not with James. Ethan wasn't sure what had just happened, but for the first time since this all began, the weight in his chest eased. James didn't say anything more. He just gave Ethan one last glance, something in his eyes that felt like encouragement, before walking away, leaving Victoria in the sinking heat of her own discomfort. The soft murmur of the poolside had slowly settled into a heavy silence, punctuated only by the occasional splash of water and the distant hum of summer conversations. Just as Ethan began to resign himself to the discomfort of the lingering whispers and cold stares, a new sound broke through the oppressive quiet, a rhythmic cadence of high heels tapping on the polished stone walkway. The sound grew steadily louder, resonating like a heartbeat that both comforted and commanded attention. All eyes shifted. Even Victoria Sinclair, who had been trying to maintain her stern composure despite the evident tension, found herself distracted by the approaching figure. The air itself seemed to pause, as if nature recognized the significance of this moment. In that instant, time appeared to slow, drawing every guest's gaze toward the entrance of the pool area. Emerging from the shimmering heat was Judge Olivia Carter. She moved with a dignified grace that bespoke years of experience, wisdom, and quiet strength. Her presence was magnetic, a blend of authority and maternal warmth that immediately softened the atmosphere. Dressed in a flowing navy blue summer dress, perfectly tailored to highlight her poised figure, she radiated both elegance and approachability. Her dark hair, styled in soft waves, framed a face that carried the gentle lines of a woman who had seen many storms and emerged with her integrity intact. As she drew closer, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His eyes, still, brimming with unshed tears from the earlier humiliation, lit up with hope and recognition. He couldn't help but break into a small, tentative smile. Through the din of whispered conversations and the rustling of fabric, he managed to call out, "Mom!" The sound of his voice, pure and clear, cut through the murmurs like a beacon. Judge Olivia Carter paused, her eyes softening as they met Ethan's. In that moment, the world seemed to realign itself. Her gaze, warm and attentive, shifted immediately from the surrounding onlookers to her son, absorbing every detail of his expression, his slight apprehension, his lingering hurt, and his undeniable resilience. Victoria's face paled visibly. The previously unshakable veneer of superiority crumbled for a split second, revealing an expression of shock and realization. For a moment, the air was thick with unspoken words. It was clear to everyone present that the arrival of Olivia Carter was more than a simple appearance. It was a Declaration, a declaration that the values of integrity, fairness, and respect were not only cherished, but fiercely protected. Olivia stepped gracefully onto the poolside deck, her eyes never leaving Ethan. "Ethan, my dear," she said softly, her voice imbued with both authority and a mother's unconditional love. "I'm here now. Are you all right?" Her tone was gentle, yet carried an unmistakable firmness that silenced any lingering doubts. Ethan's response was almost immediate, a mix of relief and determination. "I'm okay, Mom," he said, his voice quivering slightly. I was just trying to swim." His words were laced with both defiance and vulnerability, a poignant reminder that despite the challenges, he still clung to his innocence and love for the simple joy of splashing in the water. At that moment, Olivia's eyes turned to Victoria, whose confident facade was now thoroughly deflated. The crowd around them grew silent, as if waiting for the next act in a drama that had unfolded before their very eyes. Olivia's gaze was direct and unyielding. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone measured but carrying an unmistakable edge. Victoria fumbled for words, her usual eloquence drowned out by the gravity of the situation. I was merely ensuring that everything was in order," she stammered, attempting to regain control. But her words, weak and uncertain, only further exposed the hypocrisy behind her earlier actions. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in disappointment, a clear indication that she expected better behavior from someone in Victoria's position. "It appears that a child was made to feel unwelcome simply because he does not fit an expectation," Olivia stated, her voice resonating with quiet authority. "That is not the standard we uphold here at this club or anywhere else where respect is a value." Her words hung in the air, resonating with truth and conviction. The tension that had gripped the poolside began to dissipate slowly, replaced by a collective sense of relief. Guests who had earlier whispered behind delicate fans or furtively glanced at one another now seemed to draw comfort from the unwavering resolve of Judge Carter. Some faces softened with empathetic smiles, while others averted their gaze, unwilling to confront the reality of their own biases. Olivia moved closer to Ethan, wrapping him in a warm embrace that conveyed all the unspoken promises of protection and love. "You are perfect, just as you are, my brave boy," she whispered, her words a soothing balm to his wounded spirit. Ethan clung to her, feeling safe and cherished, his earlier pain slowly melting away in the warmth of his mother's embrace. Meanwhile, Victoria stood rooted in place, her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble under the weight of truth and accountability. The harsh sunlight seemed to reflect off her now damp forehead, as if mirroring the internal conflict she felt. In that moment, it was clear that her encounter with Judge Carter was not just a minor skirmish in a social setting. It was a turning point, a moment of reckoning where her prejudices were laid bare. As the crowd slowly resumed its quiet conversations, and the pool's gentle ripples filled the silence, Olivia continued to address the situation with calm dignity. "Let this be a reminder to us all," she said, her voice carrying across the deck, "that respect, fairness, and love must always come before unfounded judgments." Her words, filled with quiet resolve, were a call to action, a plea for everyone present to look beyond superficial differences and embrace the true essence of community. The moment was charged with emotion, a vivid tableau of human connection and the relentless pursuit of justice. In the heart of a summer afternoon, beneath the scorching sun and amidst the crystalline water of Brookdale Country Club, a mother's arrival had transformed an ordinary day into a powerful lesson in humanity The pool, once a stage for quiet prejudice, now shimmered with the promise of understanding and change, as Judge Olivia Carter's presence radiated hope and redefined the very meaning of belonging. Victoria Sinclair had spent years mastering the art of control, of knowing how to shape conversations, dictate social rules, and ensure that spaces like Brookdale Country Club remained exactly as she believed they should be. But now, as she sat stiffly in her lounge chair, fingers gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles whitened, she felt something unfamiliar slithering into her chest. Dread. The moment Olivia Carter stepped forward, Victoria knew in the marrow of her bones, that she had made a terrible mistake. Olivia wasn't just another club member. She wasn't some socialite whose wealth bought her access to elite spaces without anyone questioning her worth. No, she was something much more dangerous to Victoria's carefully curated world. She was respected, she was powerful, and worst of all, she was right. Victoria's throat went dry as she forced herself to meet Olivia's gaze. The woman's dark brown eyes were calm, unreadable, but there was something beneath them, something sharp and unwavering, like a blade that had been honed over years of facing battles far greater than this one. The surrounding guests sensed it too. The murmuring had stopped. The clinking of glasses had slowed. Even those who had subtly tried to distance themselves from the scene moments before were now frozen, their postures caught somewhere between discomfort and curiosity. No one wanted to miss this. Ethan stood close to his mother, no longer gripping the pool's edge, but standing tall, his small chest rising and falling with steady breaths. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't afraid either. If anything, he was watching Victoria the way one watches a puzzle they've finally figured out, like she was exactly what his mother had always warned him about, and that realization burned deeper than anything. Is there a problem here? Olivia's voice was even, her words precise, leaving no room for evasion. Victoria swallowed hard. No problem at all, she murmured. But her voice lacked its usual effortless confidence. Olivia tilted her head slightly, waiting, allowing Victoria to dig her own grave. I was making sure that everything was in order, Victoria tried again, forcing a tight, practiced smile. Olivia's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, not quite amusement. In order, she repeated, her tone carrying the weight of quiet authority. And tell me, Ms. Sinclair, what exactly did you think was out of order? Victoria's fingers clenched on the fabric of her chair. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. If she admitted the truth, if she really said what she had been thinking, there would be no recovering from it. But if she lied, if she tried to spin her words into something more palatable, Olivia would see through it. Because women like Olivia Carter, they always knew the truth before it was spoken. Victoria forced a breath through her nose. Control. Regain control. I only meant that I wasn't sure if he was here as a guest, she finally said, choosing her words carefully. Ah, Olivia hummed, nodding slightly, as if considering the statement. Then she leaned forward just slightly. So if my son had looked different, if he had been blonde, perhaps with blue eyes, would you have questioned whether he belonged? A sharp, unforgiving silence followed. Victoria's stomach twisted. Because from where I'm standing, Olivia continued smoothly, her voice never rising, never needing to. It seems as though you saw a child in the water and decided, without any real reason, that he needed to explain his presence. A muscle in Victoria's jaw twitched. She could feel the shift happening around her, the glances exchanged between guests, the subtle adjustments in posture as people began to lean away from her. She had been in control of this space for so long, and now she was the outsider. Olivia straightened, adjusting the fabric of her dress before locking eyes with Victoria again. "Let me make something clear," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "Ethan belongs here just as much as anyone else. His presence does not require permission, nor does it require your approval. Do you understand?" Victoria exhaled shakily, barely able to nod. But Olivia wasn't finished. "And next time," she added, her expression still calm but undeniably firm, "if you feel the need to question whether someone belongs, I suggest you ask yourself why you feel that way before opening your mouth." It was not a threat. It was a lesson, one that Victoria Sinclair would never forget. The air around the pool had shifted. The tension that once simmered beneath whispered conversations had now reached a boiling point, and all eyes were locked onto Victoria Sinclair. For years, she had moved through spaces like this with effortless control, dictating unspoken rules, setting invisible boundaries, always ensuring that everything and everyone fit within her carefully curated world. But now, under the unwavering gaze of Judge Olivia Carter, her power was slipping through her, fingers like grains of sand. The silence was deafening. Victoria could feel it pressing down on her, thick and suffocating. Her usual poise, so meticulously maintained, was beginning to crack. The weight of her own actions, once so easy to dismiss, now clung to her like a heavy chain, and no amount of carefully chosen words or well-practiced smiles could undo what had already been seen. The other guests had stopped pretending not to watch. Some sat rigid in their lounge chairs, their sunglasses, hiding expressions of discomfort, while others whispered behind manicured hands, exchanging glances filled with second-hand embarrassment. Victoria's throat felt dry as she forced herself to speak. "Judge Carter, I think there was a misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying the same forced sweetness she had always used to smooth over conflicts in her favor. But Olivia's eyes didn't waver. There was no anger there, no dramatic outburst, just a quiet, piercing disappointment that cut deeper than any harsh words ever could. "A misunderstanding," Olivia repeated, tilting her head slightly. Victoria swallowed hard. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, but she refused to let it show. "I only meant to uphold the standards of the club," she tried again, choosing her words carefully. "We have rules for a reason. Surely you understand that." James Holloway, who had been standing nearby, let out a small, incredulous laugh. "That's an interesting way to phrase it," he said, shaking his head. Victoria shot him a sharp glance, but quickly returned her focus to Olivia. "I assure you, Judge Carter, I had no ill intentions," she pressed on. For a moment, Olivia simply studied her as if measuring the weight of every word. "No ill intentions," Olivia repeated, her voice smooth and steady. "Then tell me, Ms. Sinclair, when you saw my son in that pool, what exactly made you feel the need to intervene?" Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out, because the truth, the real truth, was something she could never admit out loud. She could never say that she had assumed Ethan didn't belong, that she had looked at him and immediately questioned his presence, that she had felt the need to assert herself because deep down, something in her had resisted the idea of him existing freely in her space. She could never say those things, not here, not now. But the silence that stretched between them said it for her. Olivia nodded slowly, as if she had expected as much. "I thought so," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. Victoria's face burned. She had spent her entire life mastering the art of social politics, of knowing what to say it, how to remain in control of every situation. But this was different. This wasn't a polite disagreement over club policies or an argument about dress codes. This was a reckoning. And the worst part? No one was coming to her defense. The guests who had once eagerly flocked to her, who, had laughed at her carefully curated remarks, who had nodded along to her opinions, were now silent. Even the ones who had agreed with her in private now refused to meet her gaze. She had exposed herself, and there was no undoing it. The pool water rippled gently as Ethan shifted slightly, still standing beside his mother. He hadn't said anything since Olivia arrived, but he didn't need to. He was watching, taking it all in, learning in real time what his mother had always taught him. That people will reveal who they truly are if you give them enough time. Victoria exhaled slowly, forcing herself to regain some semblance of composure. I apologize, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words tasted foreign on her tongue. She wasn't used to apologizing, not like this, not when it truly mattered. She had spent years believing she was always right, that her perspective, her rules, her unspoken standards were the foundation on which places like Brookdale, Country Club thrived. But now, standing beneath the sharp, unwavering gaze of a woman who had built a career on dismantling injustice, she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. The club wasn't hers. The world wasn't hers. And maybe, just maybe, it was time she learned that. The once lively atmosphere of the Brookdale Country Club pool had shifted into something tense, something unspoken yet undeniably present. The sun still burned high in the sky, the water still glistened under its golden rays, but the air was thick, heavy with an awareness that had settled over every guest, lounging beneath the shade of pristine umbrellas. Victoria Sinclair stood frozen in place, her manicured fingers gripping the edges of her lounge chair as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The words had already left her mouth. I apologize. But they hung in the air, fragile and unfamiliar, like a foreign language she was speaking for the very first time. No one rushed to her defense. No one filled the silence with reassurances. And the worst part? She knew why. For years, Victoria had carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. She wasn't the kind of person who raised her voice or engaged in public confrontations. She didn't need to. Her power had always been rooted in subtlety, in carefully chosen words, in knowing glances, in the ability to make someone feel small without ever needing to say something outright cruel. But here she was, standing beneath the unrelenting gaze of Judge Olivia Carter, stripped of the effortless authority she had always assumed was hers by right. Ethan stood beside his mother, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face a mix of defiance and something deeper, something raw. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he had been made to feel like an intruder in a space where he should have been able to simply be. And Olivia was watching. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't reveling in Victoria's discomfort. She was simply waiting to see if the apology would carry weight, waiting to see if Victoria truly understood what had just happened. Victoria swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry, her chest tight. I didn't mean to offend anyone, she said, trying to steady her voice, but it wavered slightly. Olivia arched a brow, unimpressed. You didn't mean to, she echoed. And yet, you did. Victoria felt the heat creep up her neck. She had walked into this day expecting nothing more than an afternoon of leisure, a few light conversations with the usual crowd, maybe a cocktail before heading home to her perfectly curated life. She had not expected this. She had not expected to be standing in front of a woman whose name commanded respect beyond the walls of this club. A woman whose reputation wasn't built on privilege or status, but on integrity, on fighting for fairness in places where it had long been denied. And she certainly hadn't expected to feel like this. Exposed, uncertain, small. For the first time, Victoria Sinclair wasn't the one dictating the rules. She was the one being judged. She glanced around, hoping, praying for someone to intervene, to shift the attention away from her, to make this moment disappear. But the guests who had once been her silent supporters now seemed distant, detached. Some looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their drinks or the latest gossip, while others observed with quiet, unreadable expressions. She wasn't just standing alone. She was alone. A slow exhale left Olivia's lips, measured and controlled. "An apology means nothing without reflection, Ms. Sinclair," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "You assumed my son didn't belong here. You spoke to him as if his presence needed to be justified. And now, when confronted, you offer words without weight." Victoria flinched. "That wasn't my intention," she insisted, but even she could hear the weakness in her own voice. "Perhaps not," Olivia conceded, "but the damage is done, and next time your assumptions might not be met with patience." The words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, a quiet warning wrapped in civility. Victoria inhaled sharply, searching for something, anything to say that would restore some semblance of control. But there was nothing. The truth was laid bare for all to see. And Ethan? He was still watching her. His eyes, deep, thoughtful, far too wise for a child his age, held something that made Victoria's stomach churn. Not hatred, not anger, just disappointment. And somehow, that was worse. Victoria had spent years maintaining an image of sophistication, of grace, of effortless dominance in social spaces, but no amount of wealth or carefully curated prestige could erase the fact that, in this moment, she was simply wrong. And the boy standing before her knew it. Olivia straightened, giving her one last look before turning to Ethan. "Ethan, do you want to leave?" she asked, her voice softer now, holding only concern for her son. Ethan hesitated for only a second before shaking his head. "No, Mom," he said, lifting his chin slightly. "I want to swim." A slow smile ghosted across Olivia's lips. "Then swim," she said simply. Ethan took a breath, then turned back to the water, and without another word, he jumped in. The splash echoed through the silence, a final punctuation to the conversation, a declaration in itself. He belonged here. And no one, not Victoria Sinclair, not the stares, not the whispered judgments, could take that away from him. The echo of Ethan's splash rippled across the pool, sending tiny waves outward, disturbing the stillness of the moment. The murmur of conversations had returned, but it was different now, softer, uneasy, as if no one quite knew how to pick up where things had left off. Victoria Sinclair stood rooted in place, her arms stiff at her sides, her nails digging into the fabric of her cover-up. She had spent years in places like this, in exclusive spaces where she dictated the unspoken rules, where her presence was met with quiet nods of approval, where she could steer a conversation with a single raised brow. But today she had lost control, and people had noticed. She could feel it in the way their gazes flickered toward her before darting away, how their voices dipped just slightly when she passed. No one was saying anything outright, of course they wouldn't, but the silence was just as damning. James Holloway had returned to his lounge chair, sipping a fresh glass of iced tea, watching everything with an expression that was far too satisfied for her liking. The group of women who had once giggled at her every anecdote now sat stiffly, their postures unreadable, their eyes carefully avoiding hers. Even the lifeguards, who had spent most of the day lounging in their high chairs, seemed unusually alert now, their focus shifting subtly between Ethan and her. Victoria wasn't used to this feeling. Discomfort, exposure. For the first time in as long as she could, remember she wasn't the one dictating the narrative, and it stung. She reached for her drink, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the crystal glass to her lips and took a slow sip, as if the cool liquid could somehow soothe the burning in her chest. It didn't. Across the pool, Ethan surfaced, his laughter bubbling up as he kicked through the water. Olivia stood nearby, watching her son with quiet pride, her presence a silent but undeniable force. Victoria's gaze lingered on them, longer than she meant to. She had spent years believing she knew people, understanding who belonged where, making split-second judgments that had never been questioned before. But Olivia Carter, she wasn't just a member of the club. She wasn't just another mother watching her child swim. She was something else entirely. Victoria knew of her, of course. Everyone did. Judge Olivia Carter was a name that carried weight far beyond the walls of this club. She was the kind of woman who dismantled barriers, who didn't just enter spaces, she changed them. And today, Victoria had been on the receiving end of that change. She inhaled sharply, adjusting her sunglasses, trying to ignore the uncomfortable truth settling into her bones. The world was shifting. And maybe, just maybe, she was no longer standing on the right side of it. Victoria Sinclair sat alone. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the Brookdale Country Club, painting everything in hues of gold and deep amber. The day was waning, but the sting of what had happened still clung to her skin, heavier than the humidity pressing down on the world around her. She stirred the ice in her now watery drink, watching the cubes clink softly against the glass, her mind playing the afternoon on an endless loop. The whispered judgments, the sharp, unwavering gaze of Judge Olivia Carter, the quiet disappointment in Ethan's eyes, all of it lingered, refusing to be shaken off like an inconvenient thought. For the first time in years, she wasn't the center of effortless admiration. No one rushed to sit beside her, no one filled the silence with meaningless chatter to mask the discomfort of the moment. Instead, they had all seen her for what she was. She had always considered herself a woman of standards, a woman who upheld tradition, who maintained a sense of order. And yet, when faced with a child who had done nothing wrong, nothing except exist in a place she had subconsciously deemed not his, she had reacted with suspicion instead of welcome. She had humiliated a boy, a child, and in doing so, she had humiliated herself. A quiet splash caught her attention. Ethan was still in the pool, his small frame moving effortlessly through the water, his laughter clear and uninhibited. He had shaken it off, at least on the surface. He had chosen joy. Victoria envied him for that. But her gaze didn't linger on Ethan for long. It found Olivia instead. She stood near the pool, poised yet relaxed, speaking in low tones to a woman Victoria recognized from the club's board of directors. Whatever Olivia was saying, the woman nodded along, listening intently, her expression thoughtful. Even now, Olivia commanded the space, not with force, not with intimidation, but with presence. She didn't need to demand respect. She simply was respected. Victoria had spent years believing that power came from quiet control, from influencing the right people in the right ways. But Olivia's power came from something different, something real. And Victoria was beginning to understand, with a slow, dawning clarity, that the world she had once known, the world she had comfortably resided in, wasn't what she had always assumed it to be. Maybe it had never been. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Sinclair?" Victoria blinked and looked up, startled to find a young server standing beside her, her expression polite but hesitant. "Would you like another drink?" Victoria opened her mouth to say yes, to fall back into routine, into something predictable, something safe. But instead she hesitated. "No," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. "No, I think I'm fine." The server nodded and turned away, leaving Victoria alone once more. She exhaled slowly, letting her fingers trace the condensation on her glass. For the first time in a long time, Victoria Sinclair didn't have the right words, because maybe, just maybe, she had finally realized she didn't have all the answers. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. What started as humiliation ended in a lesson that Victoria Sinclair will never forget. But here's the real question. How many people in the world still think like her? How many times have moments like this happened, unnoticed, unchallenged? Now I want you to ask yourself, have you ever made an assumption about someone before knowing their story? Have you ever been in Ethan's shoes, made to feel like you didn't belong? Or maybe, just maybe, have you witnessed something like this and stayed silent? The truth is, we all have a choice. We can be like Victoria, trapped in old, outdated beliefs, or we can open our eyes, challenge our assumptions, and stand up for what's right. What would you have done in this situation? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. And if you want more eye-opening stories that make you think, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss a story that could change your perspective forever. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.